Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest is none other than the Lord Powell of Bayswater, Charles Powell, to his friends, KCMG, one of the great diplomatic and foreign affairs influencers of the nation, worked with many great prime ministers and international people. Charles, how did you get into the diplomatic service? I mean, you were first of all went to the cathedral school. Were you a choir boy there? Were you known for your great voice?
Yes, my education really started at Canterbury Cathedral Choir School, where one had to pass a voice test to get in at the age of 7.5. It was quite daunting, singing solo in a vast cathedral while people judged your voice. But actually, in the end, three of us, we were four brothers altogether, but three of us went to the school, one after the other.
And all had great voices?
Well, not great, but good enough to pass muster. And that, I think, really stemmed from the fact that my father had been a chorister at King's College, Cambridge. So, I mean, there was a bit of a family tradition. But the main reason was it was free.
But your father was an Air Vice Marshal, ultimately.
Yes.
So did you travel?
Well, we lived abroad a bit, yes.
Yeah,
we lived out in Singapore for a bit. But, yes, it did. But I was really only abroad. In those days, a government would only pay one holiday a year for children to go out to see their parents. So it was not as though I spent a huge amount of time abroad. And this was well before the time when young people set off to all corners of the world during their long vacations. The furthest I got was the far border of Turkey, and that was considered fairly glamorous in those days. But nowadays, it was like taking a London bus. Nobody would rate a journey to Turkey as anything other than mundane.
But you were born in 1941, so your father must have been in active service, was he?
He was indeed, yes. No, I didn't see him for most of the war.
And what was he doing in the war?
Well, he did various things. He was in Gibraltar for a while.
He was flying?
He was flying, but not piloting. He had never had the eyesight to do that. Then we had a spell in Northern Ireland. But I tell you this really from having been told it. I can't have any memory of it at all, except that he was shot at by the IRA, which, given my later modest involvement with Northern Ireland with Margaret Thatcher and my brother Jonathan's much wider involvement in Northern Ireland, left a slight mark on both of us, that they had an eye on us from the beginning.
And it's extraordinary because you said earlier you had four brothers, one of which Jonathan became Tony Blair's chief of staff.
Yes, he's the youngest.
Your other brother, Chris, was knighted for his and was a very successful advertising man.
But also a Labour activist as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he ran the Labour, he was the Tim Bell, I think, of the Labour Party.
Yeah. And you should end up working for two of our great Conservative prime ministers.
Yeah, but I worked for them as a civil servant, remember,
yeah, of course,
whereas Jonathan worked for them in the end. Jonathan was a civil servant, but he opted out when Tony Blair came along and took on the role as a political advisor. And so, slightly different. And,
anyway, after Canterbury, where did you go?
Well, straight on to the King's School. Probably the only option. One learned so little at the choir school other than singing that no other school would probably have accepted me. I certainly didn't pass common entrance.
You didn't need to. You were so clever.
Fell well short of that. Yeah, it was interesting because the whole of my education really was spent in historic buildings. Indeed, much of my life has been spent in historic buildings. But you see, the choir school was in the precincts of Canterbury Cathedral. King's Canterbury is right there in the heart of the precincts of the cathedral and has a very close association with it. And then Oxford, with a properly ancient college, new, but new in 1377.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably influenced my outlook on life.
What did you read at Oxford?
I read history.
Right.
Yeah.
Very useful.
Which at the time was actually probably the most popular. This was pre-PPE days.
Yeah.
Or not pre, exactly, but I mean, history was still the most popular school to be in. PPE was probably second then.
In 1963, you joined the diplomatic service. I mean, those days you had to do an exam.
We certainly had to do a 3-stage exam. It started with a written exam, which was quite demanding. And then you heard a month or two later if you had passed that stage. Then you were summoned for an interview before a panel. And that was quite daunting too. It was conducted in the Royal Academy. And you were ushered into a cavernous room with a big round table with great alumni sitting round it. And I walked in, and nobody said anything, and there was one chair vacant at the table, so I marched across the room and sat on it. And without looking up, the chairman said after a pause, "Sit down, Mr. Powell." So I don't know whether it was a conscious attempt to destabilise or just coincidence. And then if you survived that stage, then there was a final interview. And at the end of it all, I think 11 of us were selected that year, who a number subsequently dropped out. So we were actually quite a small band from
And you still mates with your sort of initial?
Hardly at all now. Sadly, sort of, life has taken its toll. But yes, I mean, I still see a lot of people in the Foreign Office, certainly. Yeah, but I was never absolutely convinced that is where I wanted to spend all my life. The more I saw of embassies, the less I thought I wanted to be an ambassador, frankly.
Well, because...
you spend a lot of your time having parliamentary secretaries to stay and getting their socks washed for them. It's not exactly...
The social side was
yes,
not what
I was much more interested in the policy side of foreign affairs, and which merely meant being in London. And I was a lot in London, but...
anyway, you joined the diplomatic in 1963. 1965, you went to Helsinki, presumably as a junior.
As a very junior, yes. But also with the quite demanding task of learning Finnish. It turned out the British government had people who spoke everything. Chinese, Iranian, Russian, you name it. Nobody spoke Finnish. Well, there was a good reason for that. Nobody needed to speak Finnish because the Finns all speak English. But nonetheless, on a demander, we had someone who spoke Finnish. So Carla, my wife, and I, we went and lived with the Finnish family up in the north of Finland for 6 months and mastered it. It's actually a very complex language.
Doesn't it come up through Hungary and
well, it's got a remote
Turkey.
link to Hungary, yes, you're quite right. Its grammatical structure is the same, but you can't understand a word of Hungarian if you speak Finnish and vice versa. It's not as though...
And it must be a very difficult language to learn.
Well, it is a difficult language to learn, except that it's regular. It obeys its own rules, whereas English, is full of exceptions. But Finnish obeys the rules.
And presumably you were observing Russia at that point.
Well, most of the activity, frankly, was in relation to the Soviet Union, which is, 100 kilometres to the east of us. And Helsinki in those days was crawling with spies of every conceivable denomination. The Americans had a huge embassy there. The Russians, even though it was so close to Russia, to the Soviet Union, they had a vast embassy there. And there was a constant sort of coming and going of spies. I remember a particular incident at the time. We had a visa section British visa section, run by an elderly lady called Lisa the Visa. And one day I was summoned by the spooks in the embassy and told that an important Russian was trying to defect and would come to the embassy, and I must go down and warn Lisa that if someone of this description came in, she was to let me know immediately and we would spirit him away. So I marched down there proudly and said, Lisa, if this guy shows up... Oh, he's been, she said. I said, where is he? Oh, I gave him a form to fill in and told him only to come back when he had finished filling in the form. So a poor Russian trying to defect, stuck in a coffee bar somewhere in Helsinki, trying to fill in his form application for a visa to come to London. We got him in the end.
Anyway, no language was required when you became first secretary in Washington in 1971.
No, that's true.
And that must have given
never underestimate the differences between English and American.
That was the foundation, presumably, of the sort of incredible association and knowledge you've had of America. Yes,
I think that's fair to say. I was very fortunate. We had sent... this was the beginning of the Conservative government elected in 1970.
Yeah.
And we had sent out as ambassador Lord Cromer, who had been governor of the Bank of England. So quite unusual, even in those days, to have a non-diplomat.
And he was a formidable figure.
He was a formidable figure, a kindly figure. I hadn't got a clue about foreign affairs. I mean, he knew all about banking, but that was only part of the story. But he was a on the whole, engaging person to work for. And the best thing from my point of view was because he was not trained in having to memorize conversations and so on, if he was summoned to see President Nixon, or more likely still Henry Kissinger, I was always taken along so I could remember what had been said and dictate a fluent note on return of it without taking any notes, for the actual meeting. So I was unostentatious. So it did expose me to a lot of...
and it also started your very close friendship with Henry Kissinger.
Yes, you're quite right. It did start there. It didn't start terribly promisingly. I had gone down with Lord Cromer to see him in the White House, and after about 5 minutes he was called away to see President Nixon, and a very friendly secretary came in and said, "Would we like some coffee?" So we said, yes, and so she served some coffee. And Henry came back about 10 or 15 minutes later, sat down and resumed the flow of his conversation, suddenly stopped and pointed at us and said, "Who gave you that coffee?" I said, "Well, your secretary did, Henry." "Great mistake," he said. "Once you give people coffee, you can't get rid of them." So it was, but he remembered that even 50 years later. So it's.
But just describe Kissinger a little bit and the sort of huge impact he had on things, because you and he have travelled the world sort of ceaselessly almost for years and coincided on so many occasions.
Because Henry was a sort of incredible international statesman. I was a sort of minor civil servant, but he didn't mind about that sort of thing. He was interested in people who had ideas and views and liked to talk to them. He was, of course, a superstar in those days. This is a time when he had talked about the erotic power, the eroticism of power, and so on. And he had every starlet you could think of on his arm, and eventually occupied at the same time the posts of Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary, and National Security Advisor. So there was nothing like it before or since, frankly, in terms of his domination of the foreign policy scene and what was achieved during it. I mean, the end of the Vietnam War, the opening to China being just the two most prominent things, the first big arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, Middle East peace at the end of a very vexing war in 1968. So, I mean, no one's ever really equaled that in terms of foreign policy achievement. Of course, he very sensibly gave quite a lot of the credit to President Nixon, who indeed deserved it. I mean, Nixon himself was a real foreign policy thinker and frankly preferred talking about foreign policy to domestic policy. But of course, there were two Nixons. There was Nixon, the great foreign policy expert, and there was Nixon, the rather dark figure who conducted some rather extracurricular activities.
And did you know Nixon quite well, or
no? I wouldn't say
you were too
well. I mean, I've been to meetings, but,
yeah.
but no, I didn't know him in that sense. No, but it was a heady atmosphere, as you can imagine. If you're a young man in his whatever I was, late 20s, and shuttling in and out of the White House, the height of power, it does give you a degree of enthusiasm for foreign policy at the top level.
And so then you were shifted to Bonn.
Yes, I went to Bonn to run the sort of German political part of the...
That was in 74?
Yeah, it sounds about right. Yes, 74.
Anyway.
That really involved knowing everything that was going on in German politics. At again, a very interesting time, because Germany was really just emerging from the post-war shadow and beginning to act as a properly independent country, instead of being rather deferential to the Allies and so on. Then we had Brandt and then Schmidt, and then towards
Did you see
Kohl.
Much of Willy Brandt and people like that?
Not much of Willy Brandt, quite a bit of Helmut Schmidt, yes, once commissioned by our ambassador to write a speech for him to give in London, which was a daunting task. And then Kohl, yes. I mean, Kohl, I travelled with Kohl on his election train in 1976, going all around Germany. In those days, rather like America. in the old days. There were electoral trains. It was rather fun. You stopped everywhere and gave your speech from the back of the train or the platform. And it made quite an impression on me that he was an extraordinary man.
He was no friend
quite
of Thatcher.
Unlike
Thatcher and he.
Well, this was much later. Thatcher,
of course, much later.
In these very early years, the contrast was with Helmut Schmidt, sort of intellectual, quite dry, a Hamburger from the north. Helmut Kohl was a classic southerner, big, gemütlich, very sort of friendly, and his appeal to the German people was very obvious. They liked the idea of an 18-stone fat man who loved food and washed it down. But as you just remarked, I mean, that I think in some ways was the origin of one of his problems with Margaret Thatcher, that he was too big and too German, as she used to say. It was hardly his fault that he was too German.
I mean, rumour has it she used to avoid, when she saw him in a restaurant window, scuttled by.
I've never been able to stand up that story. I mean, I've heard it told millions of times, but I've never seen it. He was actually much more generous towards her than she ever was towards him. And whenever he came to see her in London, he would bring her a nice little gift, not very much, a little brooch or something like that. And the most famous time was when he invited her to come down at the weekend to see him in his constituency, as it were, which is in the heart of Germany, in the Rhineland-Pfalz, round by the Rhine. And we spent a happy day. He showed us round the little villages and so on, took her to his favourite restaurant, had his favourite dish served, which was tripe. As you can imagine, it didn't go down terribly well. She chased it round her plate, kept trying to hide it under her fork. And then took us off as the final stage of the day to see the great Romanesque cathedral in Speyer. And while she was inspecting the tombs of the early Holy Roman emperors, which lay in the crypt, Kohl took me behind a pillar and said, "Look, now she's seen me in my homeland, at the heart of Europe, on the borders of France. Surely she will now understand I'm not so much German as a European, and it's your job to convince her." So I said, "Jawohl, Herr Bundeskanzler," and we went off from the cathedral to the airport, and she climbed up into this tiny aircraft she insisted on using. There's room for about 3 people. And she threw herself into her chair, kicked off her shoes and said, "Charles, that man is so German." So at that point, I aborted the mission that I had been given to convince her he was European. But that's the rather frivolous side. I mean, she knew that they ought to be able to get on and they ought to be able to do business together because they were both, in a way, conservative. Though she never regarded Christian Democrats as true conservatives, but still they were on the right side of the divide. But it was as much a question of style as anything. And her style within Europe, as you know, was somewhat hectoring, not to say rather difficult. And it led to another encounter with him, because at European councils where the heads of government would meet together, just them, when he was in the chair one year as Germany, I did what I often did. About 5:30, 6 in the evening, I sneaked into the council chamber with a whiskey and soda and put it in front of her to make sure she kept up the pressure. And as I was trying to sneak out of the room, he beckoned me over. And he said, "I wish you wouldn't do that. You're making her worse." And I said, "But Herr Bundeskanzler, that's the whole point." So anyway, it was sad they couldn't get on better. But actually a great deal was achieved in that time when you think about it. And of course she had reservations about, well, frankly, she had reservations about Germany. She was one of that generation brought up in the 1920s and the rise of fascism. And the Second World War, of course, and she could never quite rid herself of the idea that somewhere deep in the German soul there were some dark places and there was always a risk that it might come forward again. She knew intellectually that Germany after 45 is a completely different country, but she could never rid herself of that, and that made it very difficult to persuade her to
they were moved so quickly behind a fascist leader.
Yes.
So in 83, I mean, we're skipping obviously Brussels.
Yes.
Which would have given
you... It wasn't deliberate, actually, which it might have
been. We're skipping Brussels, where you were for, obviously, 3 years, from 80 to 83. I mean, you'd covered the panoply, apart from actually physically going to Russia. You'd sort of seen the great, the major offices, and you're plucked by Margaret to come and be her principal private secretary of foreign affairs. And what was going through her mind when she chose you?
Well, sadly, that's what I can tell. All I can tell you is she used to tell people when she interviewed someone for a job like that, and characteristically during the interview, she would always talk incessantly herself. And in the end, she would say, well, he's no good, he never said anything. And having been told this in advance, the second I was through the door, I launched into a torrent of comments and thoughts and so on, to which at the end of the apparently she said, well, he's no good, he never stops talking. So quite why and how I ever got the job, I have no idea.
You're put up for the job by the permanent secretary.
Funny enough, I'd met her, wouldn't have been the permanent secretary. I had not met her, I had met her in Germany. She came on a visit to the embassy when I was there. It was the first time I met her, and the ambassador was away, and Carla and I were left to deal with her. She was leader of the opposition at the time, and my recollection of the evening was that she and Carla spent the whole of the evening arguing about almost everything, from dresses to the price of groceries. And I was largely ignored. So whether that made any lasting impression, I don't know. But
well, it actually does illustrate how important Carla's been in your career as well.
Extraordinarily important. Yes.
And you know how her relationships with people has enhanced your own.
Yeah, so she provided the personality and the.
But I think you're being a bit unfair on yourself. So Thatcher had wanted to put Britain back on the map internationally, and you were the man to do it. A daunting task, actually. You were 42 years old, had quite a lot of experience. What were the building blocks you created for her at the outset, the sort of long-term strategy?
Well, I think you have to understand the relationships between Number 10 staff and a Prime Minister, even in those days when Number 10 was very much smaller and there were probably only 4 or 5 or 6 people there instead of the legions of special advisors and so on there are now. I mean, basically, it wasn't your job to come up with a foreign policy for the Prime Minister. I mean, technically that was the Foreign Secretary's job.
Minister. Yes.
But what I think I initially thought my job was articulating her thoughts. I mean, she went in for an awful lot of shorthand, peace with freedom and justice. Well, that's great, but it's not exactly a foreign policy. But she's very, very attached to that phrase. And secondly, making sure that her views were the ones that counted in foreign policy. And it wasn't just a bureaucratic exercise by the Foreign Office, that if she had different views to the Foreign Office, and she did have very different views to the Foreign Office on many things, then it was hers which prevailed. And I felt in a small minority in that, because, I mean, I was just me. I didn't have an assistant, I didn't have a clerk, anything. And the Foreign Office had, I don't know, several thousand people over the road. So one felt one's quite often fighting a bit of an uphill battle, though of course you held the ultimate trump card in the Prime Minister being there.
But at 83 you'd come in the back of Falklands War in 82, so you were inheriting a sort of diplomatic issue.
Exactly.
You then walked into Grenada, which happened in 1983
that was fairly minor.
The American invasion,
but that the media love to blow up. But it
certainly wasn't something that Thatcher would have been pleased about. Reagan sending troops into a country.
No, but she wasn't, and she would let him know. I mean, she had no hesitation in giving him hell down the phone, and so he realised that. And indeed, the subsequent time he rang her, he said, "I feel like one of those guys in a Western movie. I should throw my hat through the door before I come in." But that
was a special relationship with
It was
Reagan.
An extraordinary relationship. Of course, it started a long time before. She met him well before she became Prime Minister, and when he was not President. And they discovered from the very first moment that they shared the same broad philosophy, strong anti-communism, determination to face down the Soviet Union, if possible to put an end to communism. They believed in low taxes, they believed in the free market, all those things. And so they spoke the same language. The difference was that he never said very much. a lot of the time listening to her, and she took advantage of that. And I mean, it's sometimes said that she had almost too much influence on his foreign policy. Well, I don't think that's actually true, but the State Department used to worry about it. And certainly he listened very carefully to her. He liked to sit next to her at summit meetings, for instance, so they could whisper to each other or pass each other notes.
Did they joke between each other, or were they not jokers?
Yes, President Reagan's jokes tended to be slightly long-winded stories, which, they were funny, not screamingly funny. But then Margaret Thatcher was never famous for her sense of humour. Probably if we had a long list of her qualities, that might come in the last two. But it was the same approach to the world.
There was a real trust.
There was a real trust.
And I guess Grenada, in a sense, was a sort of breach of trust.
Yes, but I think the trouble was it had sort of fallen below President Reagan's attention threshold, really. He'd been delegated to people down the line to do something about this tin pot little island, which seemed to have some rather nasty guys trying to run it. And the idea that it was part of the Queen's dominions, which ranked very high in Margaret Thatcher's view, was not part of his view of it. His mind was very much on the big issues, and that was the great strength of Reagan, and indeed to a degree of Thatcher.
And so 81 to 89, Reagan, I think, was in power, and obviously you copped 6 years of that. And it was a very, very satisfactory relationship. You had
it brought about the end of the Cold War, was the main achievement.
Which was, and then the relationship with Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And how did that happen?
Well, that's the interesting question you asked, because what happened was, around about 84, maybe early 85, Margaret Thatcher thought that the time had come to try to reach behind the Iron Curtain and no longer go on and on about evil empire and all this sort of stuff, but to see how we could find out about the next generations of Soviet leaders, and whether we could somehow open up Eastern Europe a bit and get it out from under total Soviet domination. And she actually organised a seminar at Chequers about this. That, in parentheses, was the way she'd like to proceed. She was a great one for seminars. She never wanted anyone for the Foreign Office there, if possible, because she said, well, I get their views all the time. I want other people's views. I want the views of business, of the military, the academics, and so on. Two things really emerged from that. One was she decided to go and visit Hungary, which was at the time regarded as the most advanced of the communist countries. Secondly, she decided to invite to visit the UK a potential future leader. And we had three names. One was a man called Romanov, who was the party secretary in Leningrad. One was a man called Grishin, who was chairman of the Soviet trade unions. And one was a young man called Gorbachev, whom most of us had never really heard of, but apparently he was becoming prominent. And letters went to all three, and he was the one who answered and came.
He came to the summit?
Well, to the summit. He came to a week. He wasn't the head guy then. He was just a member of the Politburo. But he was a rising star. And he came down to see her at Chequers. She decided that Chequers would be the best place to try to understand him and get on terms with him. And so you know Chequers. It's an impressive place to be, a great hall there, a great blazing fire. This was the end of November. And as soon as he came through the door with his wife, you knew that this was something completely different. A younger man, so the old fogies who sort of stumbled over their words and only read out bits of paper. He came in bouncing on the balls of his feet, big broad grin. His wife, very well tailored and turned out and dressed and so on, and engaged in animated conversation right through lunch, where they argued ferociously, but on perfectly good terms. Previous Soviet leaders had only ever read out statements. There was no conversation. This was unceasing conversation.
So it was political love at first sight, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they retired, or I was with them, and the Soviet ambassador was there. And after lunch, for a notional, according to protocol, half-hour meeting. Well, 2 hours and 20 minutes later, the meeting was still going on, and Paul Dennis, who was showing Mrs. Gorbachev round the library of Chequers, getting a bit desperate as to what else he could show her in the library at Chequers. But at the end of the meeting, she gave this statement from Bernard to give to the press, saying, "He's a man I can do business with," and that was a dividing line in our relations with the Soviet Union. And the first thing I was told to do was to go off and draft her a message to President Reagan to say, "You've got to meet this guy, you've got to know this guy, because he really does represent something different and new. Of course, he's still a communist, of course, he has some rather fuzzy communist ideas, but he's an open-minded guy who you could talk to freely." And the American sort of foreign policy bureaucracy was pretty skeptical at the beginning and thought she'd been bamboozled by a sharp Soviet. But in the end, Reagan reached the same conclusion.
And that was the start of it. And of course, you had Hong Kong in '84.
Yes.
Where
do we just? I mean, actually, she had gone pretty well straight from the meeting with Gorbachev. We flew to Beijing to complete the agreement with the Chinese.
This was Deng
Xiaoping, yes. Yeah. And so she had sessions with him.
Who she got on quite well with? Or?
Well, you couldn't really tell.
Right.
The language barrier is very extreme. But it was the second time she'd seen him, so it was not new. And from there, we flew down to Hong Kong, where she told them their fate, as it were, that we'd signed the agreement with China and Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty, though there would be the notional 50-year period in which it would have its own system. Well, it had its own system for 27 years, but I'm afraid that's now terminated. From there, we got on the same old plane again, flew to Guam, to Hawaii, to Washington, landing in a snowstorm, to go up and see Reagan and Camp David and spend the day with him, where, amongst other things, she signed an agreement on Star Wars, which was very much another issue of the moment, in which she tried to put limits on it so it wouldn't undermine the existing anti-ballistic missile treaties. And from there back to London. That's quite a demanding schedule, isn't it? I think that was
you're well used to it now. You've been doing this for the rest of your life, as far as I can work out.
But it was a decisive moment, I think, in ending the Cold War. That period, and I think she deserves a lot of credit for it. Obviously, the Reagan and the Americans,
and then subsequently George Bush.
Yeah, well, George Bush brought it to a sort of safe landing in the end.
Yeah,
but it was Reagan who said, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev," and so I think he was the inspiration for it.
And you had 2 years with George Bush before I think you gave.
Yes, I think
you stopped in '91,
yes.
Didn't you?
Yes, yes, I did. Yes, yeah. about halfway into '91. Yes. Who very, very generously, actually, when Carl and I decided by then that I'd had the best job I was ever likely to get in the British government service, and that I was going to go outside and see if I could do something in business instead. And George Bush gave a dinner for us in the White House very kindly, just about 10 people. It was absolutely wonderful. He was a real gentleman, George Bush.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before.
We saw quite a lot of him afterwards. He liked to keep in touch with friends, as indeed Mr. Gorbachev, to give him the credit. I mean, even when Margaret Thatcher was in decline and her mind was not in great shape, if he ever came to the UK, he would always come to see her and bring a gift or something and sit with her for half an hour, talk. And she didn't really know what he was talking about, but he did. And I thought that was a good side of his character. It also, I used to see him occasionally at seminars or conferences and things, and it was always the same. He would come up to me, and I would get the 3 Soviet kisses, and he would say, "You were a friend, but," he said, "our services told me that you were the man who made Margaret Thatcher so difficult." And I would say to him, "President Gorbachev, I mean, the one thing in life she didn't need any help with was being difficult, so it wasn't my fault." No, he would say, the KGB, as he called them, one of the terms he used, they told me you were the person who made her so difficult. So I was irretrievably scarred in Soviet eyes, obviously.
Well, you left politics and you went to then work with 2 or 3 of the major business people subsequently in the world. The Keswick family, obviously, Arno with LVMH, and was it because you wanted to carry on this incredible travel schedule? Because you seem to still do so.
Oh, that wasn't the inspiration for it. First of all, I was fascinated by Asia, and I never served in the Foreign Office in Asia, but I was very convinced about the rise of China and was going to happen. And was, in those days, it was still, even in the early 90s, not acknowledged. I mean, when I gave speeches in the early 90s to American audiences, they would be incredulous about the idea of doing business with China. What, communist China, red China, are you mad, sort of thing. And so I was very keen to spend part of my life out in that part of the world. And Bernard Arnault was another story, actually. There was a very good French ambassador in London in the...
Bernard Arnault is LVMH, of course, the great luxury brand.
And a very good French ambassador who came to see me one day, and he said, look, I don't think Margaret Thatcher understands that France is actually quite an advanced economy. I think she still has a mental picture of Frenchmen going around on bicycles wearing berets with onions attached to the handlebars. And I want her to meet some of our leading businessmen so she will understand. And I said, all right, why don't you have a small dinner and invite 4 or 5 leading businessmen, and I will bring her up from Chequers on a Sunday evening and we can have a talk. And she did, and it was actually very successful, and she enjoyed it very much. And but one of them was Bernard Arnault, so I met him at that time, and he said, well, I hope we can keep in touch. And so a couple of years later or so, when I was freed, he did get in touch and said, would I like to join his board? And this was before it was quite as big as it is now. I mean, it was, he was fairly early years of building up a great company. And that, again, was a fascinating process. I mean, I like working for people who have strong ideas, strong views, strong personality, and determined to get their way. And if one can help with that, well and good. And so,
well, it's incredible that you've been in the sort of dicky chair, as it were, of some of the major political, international political decisions and movements of the time. And Charles, you're still running around the world faster than the rest of us put together.
Off to Chicago the day after tomorrow.
Yes, well, that says it. And thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you. And I've been a very fortunate man.